Hi, good evening. I'm Joni Jones, co-president of the League of Women Voters. And I welcome you, the Santa Barbara community, and our guest speaker to our League of Women Voters Santa Barbara Free Evening Forum on Immigration and the Vote. We are videotaping tonight, and it will be shown on our website via our YouTube channel. We have a few announcements. And so before the introductions by Amanda Pelch, our moderator, I'll give you those announcements. We invite all people who are 18 and older, men and women, to be members of the League of Women Voters. You'll find us an informative group of women and men who enjoy learning and who enjoy helping others be informed voters. We do many other things, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. Join the League now for the remainder of this membership year through June 30th for $25, and you will then be on our rolls, and then our new membership year starts for 2015-16 on July 1st. You'll receive our annual renewal letter then, and you'll have a full year of membership. Earth Day is in April, as usual. Please join us in our participation at our booth on Saturday the 18th or Sunday the 19th. And you can help us staff the booths in Alameda Park. You may check with me after the meeting. Membership discussion groups for the League in April are on the local election study on district versus at-large elections. They will be the first week of April. April 6th at Valverde, the 7th at Madame Lou's, and the 8th in Carpinteria at, I believe it's 10 o'clock. And you may look at the website for details or ask me about it after the meeting. This topic will affect many California cities due to our California Voting Rights Act, and also you may want to see our forum that we did in January on our website and YouTube. It's called the District and At-Large Election. And there's also a large paper on our website that you can read about that if you're interested in that topic. Our final newsletter will be emailed around March 30th. It will also be sent to people who do not have email. Look in your inbox for a news from the League, or channel voter from the League of Women Voters. And finally, next month's April 15th, I'm proud to mention that Colin Jones, my husband, is going to chair or moderate many good panel speakers on the topic of, is this the time to establish a community choice aggregation to provide clean energy in our area? You don't want to miss this. You can, it'll be the 15th at noon. It's our usual forum that we have September through May on the third Wednesday. Let your environmental groups know too. Save the date for our annual meeting on June 13th, and now I'll introduce Amanda Pelch, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Joni. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. The district versus at-large elections. What a topic. California Voting Rights Act is at it again. Anyway, I encourage all of you to take a look at our website and look into this because, as I would assume most of us know, the city is moving to district elections, and it is, for better or worse, a very complicated topic. So, now, I have the pleasure of knowing Peggy Orchowski for the last 15 years. Her twin sister Anna is a very good friend of mine, and all the time that I've known Peggy, she's lived in Washington, D.C., but she is a Santa Barbara kid. And from the perspective of one Santa Barbara kid, myself, on another Santa Barbara kid, Peggy, wow. She has lived her dream of becoming a credentialed Washington, D.C. congressional correspondent. And I'm sure most of us in this room see these correspondents on the news, on PBS, on many different things that we probably all watch and look at. And Peggy is a real credentialed correspondent, which makes me just feel proud to know her. And she's got her credentials on because she has to use those every day when she goes into the Capitol to see what's going on. Anyway, she has lived a varied life while she raised her 2 children. She and her family have lived abroad for over 10 years, and Peggy speaks and works in 4 languages. Let me tell you a little bit more about her. Peggy was raised in Santa Barbara. She graduated with a BA in Journalism and Latin American Studies from UC Berkeley. She earned a PhD and MA at UC Santa Barbara, and then she earned another MA at Occidental College as a Coro Fellow. Is that how?
It was along with it.
Yeah, okay. She currently writes for Hispanic Outlook on Higher Education magazine in Washington, D.C., where she lives. Previously, she was a bill analyst editor for the Congressional Quarterly in Washington, a reporter for AP in Peru, an Inter-American Press Association fellow in Argentina, and a press officer for the UN in Switzerland, and guess what? A staff reporter for our good old Santa Barbara News Press. That was under different ownership than it is today. Just had to put that in, excuse me. Let's see. And one of the really interesting things that she's done is she was director of the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1983-84, was a director, organizing, recruiting, and managing 125 multilingual staff for the National Olympic Committee Department at UCSB. So, she is also just the past chairperson of the National Press Club's Freelance Committee and a board member of JAWS, a National Women's Journalism Association. Besides that, she loves to swim, play tennis, and she plays a wonderful violin. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Peggy and her life as a journalist and writer. For Hispanic Outlook magazine, she writes several features a month, plus a monthly column titled Uncensored, covering higher education and immigration issues. In 2013, she received a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism to pursue a story on the challenge American and Hispanic engineering students face from the foreign student industry to get into graduate school. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but it's a very important topic and affects many different people. Her article was published April 9, 2014 in Hispanic Outlook magazine. Now, she has written 2 books on immigration issues. Her first book, Immigration and the American Dream, Battling the Political Hype and Hysteria, was published by Rowman and Littlefield in June of 2008. It was recommended by Governor Bill Richardson as a must-read for everyone in Congress and in the Washington, D.C. think tanks. She has given over 60 book presentations on foreign affairs and foreign affair and public policy organizations and many bookstores as well throughout our country. She's appeared on television and public radio talk shows in 18 different states. She was featured in C-SPAN's Washington Journal on September 29, 2010, and her op-eds on immigration have appeared in U.S. News & World Report Opinion, AOL Online, the Indianapolis Star, and the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, among others. Her new book, which she's just finished, and is the topic tonight, in essence, The Law That Changed the Face of America. That's the title. And it's about the historic Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. This will be launched in October at the 50th anniversary of the Immigration and Naturalization Act that was signed by President Johnson, of course, at the Statue of Liberty, which I think is an interesting piece of trivia. It's one of those things, you might find it on one of those funny shows somewhere. It is, of course, the legacy of Senator Ted Kennedy, and now it is a much maligned law that did away with national quotas and opened immigration to every race, nationality, and creed. Peggy intends to give us a perspective of one of the least recognized of LBJ's Great Society laws that still endure. I'm sure most of us in this room probably remember a lot of the Great Society laws that came about in that time frame, and of course, some of them are not with us anymore. Anyway, today Peggy will tell us the history of immigration in the United States, how immigration affects voting, and how voting affects immigration. Two very different thoughts. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Peggy Orchowski.
Thanks. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here in my hometown. I actually lived here 50 years, not counting the 10 that I lived abroad, but always had a home here. Sold it in 2000 when I decided to take up permanent residence in Washington, D.C., which is a disconcerting place to live because we don't have the vote. We don't have congressional representation, and we don't have a senator, and it wasn't until, I forget the date, in the 60s, I think, that we actually got to even vote for a president. So it's kind of a weird place to be when you're covering Congress and all these lawmakers now. I passed out a little list of questions, which are to stimulate some discussion, and also just to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to immigration and the vote, because I think there's some confusion about it, and there's a lot of confusion about terms and what is an immigrant and what is who can vote, and some of these, in some ways, it's an extremely simple question, and we could be done in 2 minutes now, because. Well, we'll go into that in a minute. But in other ways, it's very nuanced, and it's very mixed up in our history. And I have just been going through a tremendous exercise in retelling the history of immigration and voting in the United States by writing this book, The Law That Changed the Face of America. And it's about the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which is absolutely the most liberal law that has ever been passed, probably in the world, for immigration. And as Amanda mentioned, it's much maligned now. Everybody wants to fix it. They say it's broken. And part of my purpose in writing this at the 50th year of its passing is to get some perspective on it, what a fantastic law it was, where we came before that. And that's part of our appreciation of immigration and voting and our ancestors as immigrants. So I am going to talk somewhat about that law and a little bit of our back history. But just to get some ground base on what are terms, and then some of these questions I'll go through as I'm talking, and then others I'd really like to have a discussion on, especially towards the end there, because they deeply involve the League of Women Voters and why you exist, and why you want immigrants to naturalize and to vote, and why we want anybody to vote. And all these things are being questioned nowadays. And what is citizenship now? But just to get to the basics, who is an immigrant? Well, for me, an immigrant is anybody who comes into the country with the intention of staying. So a visitor, a guest, a guest speaker or something like that, they're not an immigrant. But many people, and of course throughout our history, most people who came, foreign nationals we're talking about, citizens of other countries who came into the United States, had the intention of not only staying, but probably staying forever, and most likely never seeing their homelands again. And it's a huge decision for someone to immigrate, because it not only affects their own lives, but it's going to affect the lives of their descendants from there on, the culture they're going to be raised in, the language they're going to speak. I have a great awe for all our immigrant ancestors. And that's one reason I wanted everyone to write on the board back there what your immigrant ancestry is like, because we all come from immigrants now. So anyone who intends to stay is an immigrant. We're going to get into the different kinds of immigrants in a minute. But then there's this other question of American. Who's an American? Well, now, some of you might not agree with this, but American is the only universal and universally accepted term for a U.S. citizen. We don't have another word. If you say, who are you, what are you from, where are you from? We might say we're from the United States, but, who are you? I'm an American. It's the only, we don't say I'm a United Statesian. We don't have another term. And we're very loosey-goosey about using American. And we tend to think of American as being anybody who's here. But really, officially, an American is a U.S. citizen. So then we get to the third really simple question with a very simple answer, and that is, can immigrants vote? And the answer is no. The only people who can vote by law are, and especially in federal elections, but almost in any election, very few exceptions, the only people who can vote are citizens. So our whole discussion today has to do with citizenship and how immigrants become citizens and how they become citizens throughout our history. And it's a very, very interesting thing, because in the very first Articles of Confederation, and then the first Constitution of the United States, in the very first section of that Constitution is, in Section 1, is a primary duty of the United States government is that they can naturalize, they are in charge of naturalization, meaning that it was already very much accepted in that time that some people were citizens and some were not, and that there was going to be a way to naturalize, that is, to make a foreign national an American citizen. And that pledge, I'm sure most of you have been to citizenship ceremonies, it's still the same one that they used in the 1880s. I mean, the 1780s. It was actually formed then, and it has deliciously archaic words like forswear allegiance to any foreign potentate. That is still something that is repeated today. I love that, forswear allegiance to any foreign potentate. So, but citizenship, there was not an idea of a national immigration law, national immigration. We always managed immigrants, and I like to say, and you can argue, but I will argue back, that we have always managed immigration. We've always managed immigrants. We've never really had open borders. You couldn't just walk into the country and settle and become a citizen. You never could. I mean, when you think of the Boston area, I mean, if you were the right kind of Protestant, you were not welcome in Boston. If you were a Jew or if you were different kind of a Protestant, not to speak of Catholics and Quakers. You were not welcome to settle in many parts of the United States or the colonial United States. Oh, here's my sister with my notes. I've been really winging it here, so thank you. I brought all the stuff, but not my notes. Thanks so much. I think one of the basic things you learn when we're covering, and it's kind of a shock coming from California, covering immigration on a national level, covering anything on a national level, because you realize how almost every issue you can think about boils down to federal rights versus states' rights. And right from the beginning of our nation, it was very clear, and it was fought over and then made clear what were going to be federal jurisdictions and what were going to be state. Well, immigration, even though naturalization was a federal, when you were naturalized, you became a citizen of the United States, but it was states who did it. And it was local communities who decided who could immigrate into their community. Just like today, it's still up to the states to decide who can vote. And, I mean, besides citizens, but the qualifications for a voter. It's still very much a state jurisdiction. We don't have, one of my questions later on is, do we have a federal voting registration bank? We don't. Do we have federal ballots? We don't. Do we have federal registration forms? We don't. This is still very much a jurisdiction of states. And so was immigration from the very beginning. It was very much involved with states, and it remained so until after the Civil War. And again, now coming back from California, and what I didn't know about the Civil War was pretty pitiful. But back there, it is really important. And pretty soon you start judging everything about what happened pre-1860 and what happened after 1865. And there were a lot of things that the states did before the Civil War that they no longer did after the Civil War. And one of them was immigration. We did not have a national immigration law until after the Civil War. And it was in 1883. And a funny thing about that it was actually a California issue that became the first national immigration law. You could probably guess what that was. Chinese Exclusionary Act, yeah. Yeah. One of the basics about immigration, and if you think about it, you can only agree, even when if you're only looking at immigration from the immigrant's point of view, or you're looking at immigration from the nation's point of view. I say we're a nation of immigrants. So there's two elements in that short sentence. And in order to be a successful nation of immigrants, we have to balance, and we've been a really good model for this, balance both the interests of immigrants who want to come to the United States and the interests of the nation state to have immigrants, to host immigrants, because it's very much a purview of the nation state to decide who can come in and who can't. It is a national, it's a national responsibility. It is a core right of a sovereign nation to state to decide who can come in and who can't. But until the 1880s, we let the states make that basic decision. After 1880s, we started having national laws. And the first was the Chinese Exclusionary Act, because immigration's about work, and it's about jobs. And unions were very strong in this period, after the Civil War and here in California. It was quite strong, and they were very concerned about all the Chinese would come in first during the gold rush and then to build the railroads, and suddenly just flooding in just unregulated numbers. And so they made a law in 1883 that Chinese workers were to be excluded. And they would not let them come into the ports of entry. Chinese professionals were still okay. We very much honored Chinese doctors and professional scholars and all that. And they could come in, and they could stay. and they could be considered legal immigrants, but they were not allowed to naturalize. And that's going to have a big thing to do with the citizenship thing. I mean, so just remember that little point. But so 1883 was our first national law. By 1906, they developed the first national bureaucracy. I think it was in the late 1880s that Ellis Island became an official port of entry. You didn't need a visa to come to Ellis Island, but not everyone who came in was allowed to come in and stay. There's I don't know how many of you visited Ellis Island, but there's very, very poignant stories of people who came and were turned away. And I remember meeting a woman in Idaho when I was talking there, and she said her great-great-aunt, who had been, I think she was about 20 at the time, and she'd come in with her family, and she had, not cataract, she had glaucoma, and they wouldn't let her in. You had to be work able. You had to be able to work. And they said somebody with that disability or a mental disability, that was long into our history where we didn't allow people with mental disabilities to come into the United States. So you cannot say that anybody could ever come, and we've never had restrictions. We have from day one. Then 1924, so there's three big periods of immigration law, comprehensive immigration law. And 1924 was our first comprehensive law. And so think about what was happening in the 1920s, and think about between 1880s and 1920s, what was happening in the world. The famines in Ireland, the World War in Europe, and it was the period of our most greatest immigration wave. Even to this day, we don't have the number of immigrants coming into the country that we did in the period 1880 and 1920. Now, we had started to have immigration law, but it was just little pieces. And this was a completely uncontrolled wave. Well, again, corporate America, this was a burgeoning period of industrialization. The 20s had started, they were on the horizon. There was great wealth, the Gilded Age. They loved those immigrant workers, and they didn't care how many came in, where they were from. But the labor unions did, and the progressives did. The progressive movement started about that period with Teddy Roosevelt, with the refuge houses, yes.
Whole house.
Yes. And they were for refugees. All these people coming in, mainly from Eastern Europe. I call them the fiddler on the roof Jews, and who were being purged, and from southern Italy. And so there became a huge concern about their conditions, about the culture they were bringing in. I mean, this was the beginning of the abolition movement, too. That was a very much of an immigrant-driven thing. I mean, here's all these Catholics and Jews who just loved to drink, and the workers were, there's a lot of alcoholism among the workers, and that became a big Protestant movement. So we ended up in 1924 with the first comprehensive immigration law and the most restrictive law that we've ever had. And it was called the National Origins Quota Act. And it actually stated very specifically that only certain nationalities would be preferred, that they could come in without a visa, they could come in unlimited numbers. And they were mainly Northern Europeans, including Northern Irish, but gee, funny thing, they were Protestants, right? It was very much, the National Origin Quota Act was very much to limit especially the Jews and Southern Catholics from coming in. It was passed in 1924, and it was law until 1965. So all during the World War, we were very bad about letting Jews in. Of course, we didn't know about the Holocaust, but there were rumors. But we were very bad about letting Jews in during that period. And South America, where I lived for a number of years, they were much more open to Jews. There were huge Jewish communities were built up during that period, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then, of course, afterwards in the 50s. All of that time, we still had the National Origins Quota Act. So then, this next great period was 1965. And we all know now, it's 50 years since the Civil Rights Act now, that great protest of discrimination. And in doing my book, I think there were two huge drivers. There were two huge social movements that drove the civil rights. I think the first was the Holocaust, that the horror of the Holocaust, when we found out the guilt about it, and the realization of what discrimination could lead to. And then, of course, the absolute repugnance of the Jim Crow laws in the South. That drove the Civil Rights Act. So in 1964, skipping all kinds of great stuff, but if we're talking about immigration here, the Civil Rights Act passed. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated in 1963. So Johnson was unbelievably, I mean, when he became president, appointed president within a few months. He had passed not only the budget, but he managed to get the Civil Rights Act passed. What is fascinating to me as a lifelong Democrat, of course he was a Democrat. 1964, the end of 1964, the 89th Congress was elected. They call it the fabulous 89th. And it was a Congress of a huge majority of Democrats. But think, most of those Democrats were Southern Democrats. They were Southern racist Democrats. I mean, Johnson and Kennedy, he was elected in 62, he was 31. He couldn't run in 60 when his brother ran for president because he was too young to run for a Senate seat. So he ran for the seat in 62. They were liberal Northern Democrats, but they had to fight not only Republicans, but also the Southern Democrats. And they were remarkable people. And the more you read about Johnson and read about Kennedy and the great passion they had for justice and for civil rights and to end discrimination, and their willingness to compromise and their willingness to humble themselves, and most particularly their willingness not to get credit. It's just astounding. It's almost embarrassing when you think about what's going on today. And it was because of that spirit that not only did the Civil Rights Act pass, but the 89th Congress passed dozens of fantastic bills that made up the Great Society. And one of them was the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1965. What did it do? Very interesting, and I didn't realize this about civil rights. Civil rights, of course, was to end discrimination. The whole idea was to end discrimination based on race, religion, creed, and national origin. I didn't realize national origin had something to do with that. Here we had an immigration law, was the National Origin Quota Act. I mean, it was absolutely anathema to the society that was in place at that time, that we would have such an immigration bill. So the new Immigration Act completely did away with quotas, and it did away with all discrimination based on your national origin. And instead, it made an emphasis on family unification. There you can see the influence of the Holocaust, that, families were split and killed and all that. We were going to allow families to come in. So they did away with national origin quota. They did away with an emphasis on work skills. And one of the most telling things about that is that as a congressional journalist, we'll go back to this for a sec, I have certain beats. We all have certain beats. There's dozens and dozens of committees in the Senate and in the House. And they all cover a multitude of issues. They all have subcommittees. A reporter, it's very hard to cover all the committees and all the issues. So we have beats, and we cover certain committees. So for education, of course, I cover the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, Health on the Senate side, and I cover the Education and Health Committee on the Congressional side. What committee has jurisdiction over immigration? Do you know? Does anybody know? No, it's the Judiciary Committee. So I got to wondering, why does the Judiciary Committee have jurisdiction? Immigration's about work. And when it first became a national law, the jurisdiction was under the Labor Committee. It had always been under the Labor Committee. When did it become under the Judiciary Committee? Well, so very interesting, and this is something I found out in my book, and it's kind of, for a wonk like me, this was, There was this very arcane, it was a Congressional Committee Reorganization Act of 1947, Well, in 1947, they decided to change some of the jurisdictions of committees. Some committees were outdated, some had been committees that were just called on a case-by-case basis, and they decided to make them standing committees. Other, they joined together. One of the committees they decided to change was that they were going to change immigration from the Labor Committee to the Judiciary Committee. Now, why did that happen? The 1965 Immigration Act is called the Hart-Celler Act. Manny Celler, I don't know if any of you are from New York. Most New Yorkers know this name, but I never heard of him, except for the Immigration and Nationality Act. Manny Celler, a Jewish New York, a very, very activist man, came to Congress in 1923. In 1924, they passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. I mean, they passed the quota, the National Origins and Quota Act. And he, being Jewish and already concerned about what was going on, and of course that Quota Act was especially against to stop immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. So from day one in Congress, he was against that act. And he was very, very vocal trying to get that act to change. As the war started developing in Europe, he lobbied for refugees, and he'd get maybe 5,000 here, 1,000 there, just trying to bring in more Jews, but very, very unsuccessful. So in 1947, he, funny thing, was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So guess what he did? This is a wonderful little, minutia congressional thing, is that he got the jurisdiction changed. He changed the jurisdiction of immigration from labor to judiciary. He's head of the Judiciary Committee. And of course he was in 1965, and that's one reason, I think, a big reason why that act got changed. So very interesting in that way, how some congressional maneuvering can actually have such a huge effect. So let's get back to citizenship here. It was interesting that during that there really wasn't much. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. There wasn't much of a zeal by, there weren't that many immigrants at first. There were very few, and of course during the Civil War there was even fewer. And we didn't have the big wave until the 1880s and 1920s. And people who came in then, there weren't all these different kind of visas. You could pretty much have been in the United States. At first, they said you had to be a resident for 2 years. That was in the 1780s. And I think it was in 1795, they changed it to 5 years. You had to be in the United States 5 years. And then you could go to a courthouse, like a state courthouse, and apply for citizenship. And as I said, every state state had their own qualifications, what they considered to be good character and that you had lived a good life. Of course, it was mainly males, white males. It wasn't until, of course, after the Civil War that black males could become citizens and of course have the vote. But if the 5-year term was pretty much set by 1795, that you had to be in the country 5 years. And then you applied, and they accepted it, and you would become a citizen. It's interesting that during the period between 1911 and 1940, and well, actually 1945, 1950, the number of immigrants applying for naturalization just shot up. And particularly interesting, and I won't get too wonky on you here, but they were particularly coming from the countries that were involved in the war. So lots of German immigrants, Italian immigrants, and Japanese immigrants. And by the way, the Quota Act was very strongly against Japanese, which I'm wondering was one reason that just really got them very angry, and one reason they joined the Axis. They felt very, for a long time we were friendly to Japanese, and then the Quota Act was very harsh about Japanese. Latinos, by the way, there was no quota. There were very few. They were mainly in the southern border states. They were ranchers, they were cowboys, they were agricultural workers. They pretty much came and went. People knew them. There was no quota for Latinos. So even during the harshest period, there was no quota for them. What happened in 1965 then, of course, is that everybody, in a way, there was a limit to what nationality, what percentage of green cards could come from what nations. It got very confusing after 1965. They said, okay, we're not going to have any quota on any nationality. But that didn't mean, okay, we have no preference for Northern Europeans now, but that means everybody from Mexico can come in. There was still a number limit. And in 1965, and it was greatly discussed, the number limit pretty much got settled at 170,000 immigrants. This is an immigrant person is a person who could stay here permanently. The other term for a green card, you probably know about green cards, the other term for a green card is a legal permanent resident, LPR. That's the official name. So a legal permanent resident is the gold coin of the immigration visas. If you have an LPR, you can stay in the United States permanently. You have almost all the rights of citizenship, except you don't have the right to vote. You're not a citizen, but you're an LP. You're an LPR. And after that, that number of 170,000 was pretty much even Kennedy and Johnson said very clearly, they said, in many arguments in Congress on the 1965 Act, they said, this is not going to affect the demographic in the United States. This is not going to affect the numbers of immigrants. There may be a few Indians who come in, East Asian Indians, but mainly this is going to be for the people who are here already, who came from the founding nationalities, that they can bring in their families. That will be the main number, is that they can bring in their extended families. You could always bring in your spouses and minor children. But they really sincerely did not think, had no idea what an impact this was going to have, that this law was going to open up immigration to people from all over the world. Well, so the first thing that happened was that sellers and groups started pressing for more and more, of course, Jewish people. And Jewish people, during the quota period and during the war, Jewishness was considered a nationality. My son is married to a Latvian, Russian-speaking Jewish girl, and her family, who immigrated in the 1980s, showed me their Latvian passports. And on the passport, it's a Latvian passport, you open the passport, and it says, nationality Jewish. So Jewish was considered one of the nationalities that there was a strong quota for. After that, it became what country you were from. And the law became, and it still exists today, and I don't know how many congressmen even know this, but there's a 7% rule. So no country can have more than 7% of all the green cards given out in any year. So now of course, some countries, there's far more than 7% of those numbers of cards who are going to apply. And they get put on a waiting list. It's not a quota, but everybody is treated equally. So Mexico gets 7%, and Guatemala gets 7%, and Iceland gets 7%, and India gets 7%. Everybody's equal. And the whole idea was that we are not going to discriminate on the basis of national origin. So everybody is equal. How can you not discriminate on national origin but say, oh no, but all the Mexicans can come in because they're a neighboring country? I mean, we could do this if we wanted. We could pass a law and say, we're going to have a special status for Mexicans, as we did for Cubans. But we haven't. So until now, everybody is equal, because we don't discriminate on the basis of national origin. And now it's what country you come from. The thing is, the numbers have crept up. From 170,000 we now have, does anyone know how many new green cards we give out every year? Anybody know? It's 1.2 million, and it's growing all the time. And it was growing by little bits here and little bits there, and refugees here, and just all kinds of special categories, and raising the numbers because of labor needs. I mean, the problem with this, with the 1965 Act, is we did away with we did away with the work visas, and yet the country needs workers. We need people with special skills. That's why a nation state loves immigrants, because they want that immigrant worker. So we invented, and I'm saying that one of the unintended consequences of the Nationality Act was we suddenly had all these temporary visas. We start developing this whole alphabet soup of temporary visas. Can you name some of the temporary visas? When you think of somebody on a temporary visa, what comes to mind? Students, for sure. Foreign students. That was one of the first ones.
The J visa.
The what?
The J visa.
Yeah, J visa is a scholar visa. The H-1B visa, you hear a lot about that. Those are the high-skilled workers. The H-1A visa, which is agricultural workers. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of them now. They all have one thing in common. They're temporary. They are written on the visa, non-immigration visa. So there's really, the only visa that you can become a citizen from is an immigration visa, which is the legal permanent resident visa, that green card, that 1.2 million immigrants that we let in every year on the legal permanent resident. And it is still to this day, the majority are given out because of extended family affiliation, not because of work. So that's why we have all these temporary visas. Well, of course, corporate America loves temporary visas, They get them at their best, and then they can kick them out. And it's very hard. Some temporary visas, the O visa, that's a visa that you can, if you get an O visa, it's the so-called genius visa. Somebody will bring you in. It's much higher than the J visa. And it's very easy to convert the O visa to a green card. There's certain visas that they give preference to. A new one, and this has been in the last 5-10 years, is the investor visa. You can come in as an investor for $1 million. You can essentially buy yourself and your family a green card. You have to invest in an area that is designated a needed area for investment. You have to employ American workers or workers who are legal immigrants, legal permanent residents. But after 5 years, the investor and his whole family gets a green card. So there are ways to convert the temporary visas to green cards, but it's very difficult. And I must say, most immigration lawyers make most of their money off of trying to find ways to help people on temporary immigrant visas, and especially foreign students, to convert to that green card. And then, of course, we have this whole other category of people who are in the country illegally. And that visa is not, it's not a visa. They do not have the right to be here, and it's almost impossible to convert unless it's by congressional an amnesty, which the 1986 law was called an amnesty, and that's what it was. And it actually did allow people who were here illegally before the 1986, if they could prove it, if they could pass certain qualifications in terms of having been law-abiding, except for that, they were eventually could be granted, they could apply for and be granted a green card. Okay, so the green card now, that's the only visa that you can convert to become a citizen. Does anyone know, is it automatic? Does somebody automatically become a... No.
You have to study.
Sorry?
You have to study.
You have to apply. Yeah. And the basic requirement is that you have to be on the green card for 5 years. Now, there's a couple of exceptions to that. If you marry an American citizen, you can, and you have a green card. And it's not automatic anymore. It used to be pretty automatic. You'd marry an American citizen and you get a green card. That has been so abused, which is always too bad because you have something good and then it gets abused. So now it's not automatic. They pretty much will check if you really are in a legitimate marriage, how long you've known the person. I mean, they ask everything and. And there are more and more cases where, say it's a foreign student and they marry an American, they will pretty much say, you go home for a few years with your spouse and then come back and you can get a green card then. If it's a legitimate marriage, they've been married several years, they might have kids by now, they've really been together, even though they aren't living in the United States, they can get a green card. But it's not automatic. And it's never automatic to become a citizen. Everyone has to apply for it. There's only one group that it's automatic. And do you know what that is?
Born in the United States.
The what?
If they are
Born in the United States, right. So here we have the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. Remember I said everything happens either before the Civil War or after the Civil War. Remember I said we did not have national immigration laws till 1880s. So the 14th Amendment really had nothing to do with immigrants. It was part of the three, what do they call it, Reconstruction amendments, 13, 14, and 15, to establish and make sure that especially African Americans, in those days called blacks or Negroes or what, were considered full citizens. Remember, they were only considered to be 2/3 citizens. So those amendments were to make sure that they were considered full citizen. So the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment is just, it's an amazing amendment, and it is referred to so many times in civil rights, of course. But the very first sentence, the very first part of the first sentence, establishes this so-called birthrights citizenship. And it says, anyone born or naturalized in the United States. And then there's 6 words that everybody ignores because it's just kind of legalese and blah, blah, blah. So then they skip next to the good part, which is a citizen of the United States. But there's 6 little words, like I said, that ignored, and the first word of the 6 is and. So that means there's 2 conditions you have to meet in order to get birthright citizenship. And the next 5 words are, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, where's my, I always have it, but I don't have it with me. The Constitution and the amendments is very small. You know, I usually carry a little book that way. Very, very tightly written. Many of the amendments are just a few words. Every word counts. If the people who wrote this amendment had wanted to say anyone born in the United States is a citizen, they would have said that. But they didn't. They put in this condition, the second condition. So there's where it gets interesting. This is where, you know, it sounds simple, but it isn't. There were exceptions. And I actually went to the Congressional Research Service, a fabulous service in the Senate and in the House, and they will do research on every law and background, and it's just a fantastic source, especially for a reporter. So, and for staff, you know, of legislators who are trying to write laws. So they said there were actually 4 groups in 1868 when the 14th Amendment passed. There were 4 groups that were not subject to the jurisdiction, and therefore their children were not considered citizens, even if they were born in the United States. And 2 of those groups still exist. One group was changed by the Supreme Court, and the 4th group was changed by law. So I'm just giving you that background to say that to change the meaning of the birthright citizenship does not require a constitutional amendment. It's an interpretation, and it's already seen changes on who it covers. And I mean, one thing about immigration laws, and I hope you're getting the idea now as I'm talking about the history of them, is that they change. They are never, I mean, I sigh a little bit when Obama says, let's get it done once and for all. It's never going to be done once and for all. You know, immigration law is a work in progress. Immigration changes all the time. It changes with world conditions. It changes with economics and demographics and technology. I mean, technologies have made huge changes in immigration. And immigration laws have to change too. And you know, one of my conclusions of my book is that this wonderful 1965 Act, which was so generous, so incredibly liberal, is now maligned. I mean, you'd think it was, some people practically call it Nazi, you know. And it's a fabulous law, but it's 50 years old. There's some parts of it that need to be, you can call it reformed, fixed. I just say, it's not really broken, they just needs to be updated. And some parts of it need to be changed now. So I'm going to pretty much stop now, except I'd like to go back to our board there. And I don't know how many of you wrote down what the national background of your relatives were. But I'm wondering how many of you have grandparents and parents who were immigrants, who came in as immigrants? Okay, I'll get about half. How many of you know if they became citizens? You all know if they became citizens. Did they all become citizens? I think, Ron, you're not sure about your grandparents now. Ron's were part of the Italian wave that came in the 1920s. He grew up with his wonderful Italian grandparents in Connecticut. He's not sure if they ever became citizens. And in fact, the fact is that the vast majority of people who come in and have green cards, and again, is nothing automatic, and there's nothing that obliges you to become a citizen. The vast majority, over 60%, never become citizens. So that's an interesting thing. And even of the group, 86, that got amnesty, and at the time they figured about 1 million people who were here illegally would get amnesty and get a green card. And it actually came out to about 3 million now, so it's almost close. People are still coming out with documents, but it's about 3 million. Even of that group, way less than half naturalized to become citizens. So the interesting question for the League of Women Voters and for all of us who are involved in immigrants, and in some way to counteract some of the stuff of some of the people who are very much against legalizing people who are here illegally, and they say, well, they just want them, mainly it's Republicans who would say this, the Democrats want to legalize everybody so they'll go vote Democratic in 2016. I mean, it's so absurd. Of course, that would never happen. Even if they're legalized, they would have to get a green card, which is going to take a long process. Then they'd have to be on the green card for 5 years. Then they would have to choose whether they're even going to be a citizen and go through that process, which can take a good year. And then they have to register to vote. So I think when you're talking about immigrants in voting, what you want, first of all, is to go after citizens who aren't registered, of course, and particularly naturalized citizens who haven't registered to vote. But you really also want to try to appeal to people who have been on the green card for more than 5 years. Encourage them to naturalize and encourage them to vote. Now, it's really interesting when you start talking to immigrants. I have a lot of friends. My own husband took 30 years on a green card before he became a citizen. And why not? Why don't they want to become a citizen? What is citizenship? I have a friend and a law professor I think he's at Vanderbilt. He wrote a book called Beyond Citizenship. Oh, citizenship's obsolete now. We're a global nation. We're global citizens. It doesn't matter if you're a citizen. He made a presentation at a think tank, and I went into the ladies' room afterwards, and there's this woman just bawling her head off, and I just said, gee, what's the matter? Can I help you? And she goes, I'm just so upset at that book. She said, I just dreamed of being a citizen, and I made all the efforts, and I was so proud. It was the happiest day of my life when I became a citizen. I can't stand that young man says it doesn't mean anything. So, we have this whole kind of new wave of global citizenship, and borders don't count, and, the minute you're here and you eat a hamburger, you're an American. So there's things like that kind of devalue. And one of the big things that even Democrats are saying we should not have birthright citizenship for is these birth tourists. The tens of thousands of Chinese, particularly Chinese, but I know Germans who've done it, come in, have their child here, and go home with a German passport. With an American passport. Absolutely no intention of attaching to the country, contributing to the country, but because of birthright citizenship, and they're here legally, they can walk out with a passport. So maybe we need to look at birthright citizenship too. There's some legislation, two-page piece of legislation in the Congress right now saying we need to relook at birthright citizenship, say it can only go to if at least one of the parents is a citizen or an LPR, a legal permanent resident. Otherwise, we shouldn't give out citizenship just to anyone who happens to have a child in the United States. These are all legitimate questions that somehow get sometimes mixed up in the whole idea of civil rights and equality and racism and everything else. But these are legitimate immigrant questions that our founding fathers and throughout our history we have struggled with. And it's one of the main major responsibilities of a nation state to preserve their citizenship, to say who can come in, to protect their borders. And like it or not, we have to choose. We can't have open borders, and we have to choose. So that's all based up with of immigration and citizenship. And I'd love some of your reactions to this.
Wait for the mic.
Oh, I'll wait for the mic.
Oh, yeah. Well, Marty's got the mic.
Thank you, Marty.
With regard to birthright citizenship, those 6 little words
Right.
in the 14th Amendment
Right.
that says that depending upon jurisdictional, what are those 6 words again?
And under the jurisdiction thereof.
And under the jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction thereof. So they're under the jurisdiction of laws. Oh, yeah, I didn't go through the groups that were not.
Right, but would those 6 little words deal with the issue of women who are coming to the United States to give birth to a child just to get a passport? Would it deal with that?
Well, the thing is, it's probably more relevant to people who are illegally here, and are they under the jurisdiction? And more, people are excusing illegal immigrants from certain laws. And you just wonder how many laws are supposed to be under the jurisdiction of apparently not immigration laws, which are, after all, U.S. laws. But they are, so a tourist comes in, they're not an immigrant, they're a visitor, but they do have legal status, and they are under the jurisdiction of the law, but they can change that. They could change that probably by legislation. And that's why I said this legislation that's on the table now says that you have to have, to be under the jurisdiction of you have to have at least one parent who's a citizen or a legal permanent resident. By the way, the most common and sensible group that is not under the jurisdiction of is diplomats with full immunity. And of course, we have hundreds of them in Washington, D.C., that they come here, they're under full diplomatic immunity, they are not under the jurisdiction of U.S. laws, they can commit murder, and we have to ask their countries to give up that waiver so that we could try them, though. So that's the most common group. The other 2 groups are kind of interesting. One, remember the Chinese I was telling you about? So Chinese could be here legally, but they weren't allowed to naturalize. So in late 1890s, a boy who was born to a Chinese couple in San Francisco wanted to get a U.S. passport under the 14th Amendment, and they refused because they said his parents weren't allowed to naturalize, and he said, well, that doesn't have anything to do with it. They're under the jurisdiction, they're here legally. And I went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of him so it was the legal status of the parents that made them under the jurisdiction, which again calls into question, are illegal immigrants under the jurisdiction in that sense? No. The 4th group, very interesting, was American Indians. And as you know, Indians, from the very beginning of our nation, lived in their own nations. And they were not considered citizens. And they did not have the power to vote as long as they lived in their nation. And it actually came into a big problem when at the Trail of Tears, which I think was the 1830s, and there were 3 or 4 tribes that were shoved out of Tennessee and those areas, and sent to new nations up but what we don't hear much about is that there were thousands of those tribe members who didn't join the Trail of Tears. They stayed in the territory of the United States. So what happened to them? They weren't citizens now. So finally, I think it was in 1850s, 54 I think it was, before the Civil War, the Supreme Court ruled that members of those tribes who had lived in the United States for 10 years, had adopted American dress, had learned the language, had assimilated, could be naturalized. They were considered foreign nationals, and they could be naturalized. It wasn't until 1921 that we passed the Indian Voting Rights Act, that all Indians, whether they were born in their nations or in the territory of the United States, were given voting rights. After women. Imagine. So that was kind of interesting. And that was all under the 14th Amendment.
As you know, Peggy, I just got back from Cuba.
Right.
And I understand that Cubans are treated differently.
Right.
And
We did pass a
particularly,
special law.
yeah, particularly Cuban doctors.
Right.
Could you speak to that?
I don't know too much about it, but it was a big issue in 1965. Now, like I said, even the National Quota Act did not have any quotas for Latinos. So that was one group that very much did not like the new law because they suddenly were subject to the 7% rule. But Cuba was a big point of contention during the debate. The Latinos, whether to put them under it, and or mainly Central Americans, Mexicans and Central Americans, and Cubans. And they let the Cuban one go. They just said, we're gonna, it's like slavery, we're gonna discuss that at another time. And I think it was 1966 or 67, and of course this was, with Fidel Castro and the communism and all that, they opened up the dry land rule. And the main reason was because those first, I think there were 5 waves of Cuban immigrants. The first 2 waves were all the brain drain. They were the business people, the creative people. They wanted them. And of course, they established a home base in Florida and became a political power. So that, that's going on today still. It's quite interesting. It is possible, if the country decides to pass a law, that we give, say, Mexico a special deal, because they are our neighbors and we have a long, long history with them. And by the way, one of my funniest stories is the long history the Mormon Church has had with Mexico, and they're very closely attached, and so there probably could be such a rule, but I'm not sure the rest of the Southwest might like it, but the rest of the United States might not go for it. And then you get the Irish. I mean, there's tens of thousands of Irish who are here illegally. And every time you have a hearing on illegal immigration, there's always this rows of kids in these bright green shirts, and I love to go interview them because they have these wonderful brogues, but they all demand special treatment. We're part of the founding nationalities, that we should get special treatment too. So you just open a Pandora's box when you start going back to nationality, quotas and preferences. Where does it end? If Mexico, why not El Salvador? I mean, in Washington, D.C., most of the Latinos are from El Salvador. Why not them? It just opens a Pandora's box.
If someone is granted refugee status, what is their path to citizenship?
It's a fantastic deal because, unfortunately, it's extremely limited in number. But they are sponsored. They get a sponsor, so they can't just come in and go anywhere they want. They usually go for 1 year at least and often it's a church that sponsors them. And they're supposed to learn English, find a job, try to settle in, and the sponsor helps them. And then they're given a green card. And then it's up to them to decide if they want to be a citizen. Again, anybody with a green card, they are not obliged ever to become a citizen. And like I said, most don't.
What's your prognostication for the 2016 election? And with all the wannabes running around, what
You mean
is...
about immigration? I was going to talk about immigration.
Yeah.
Well, to me, the story, and my other book about hype and hysteria was mainly directed at the press. I'm just really annoyed how the press misses almost everything that I just even talked about today. It's become a racial thing. I mean, one kind of bad thing about the 1965 Act was that because it passed during the Civil Rights era, it kind of became tainted with the idea that immigration's a civil right, which of course it isn't. It's not a civil right to immigrate, and it's certainly not a civil right to be in the country illegally. But somehow, illegal immigrants particularly became like the new discriminated against class. And so we've gotten into this left, right, civil rights, good guy, bad guy, anti-immigrant and pro-immigrant thing, which has nothing to do with the main problems of immigration is who are we going to let come in and who not? And we have to choose, and we can't choose on the basis of race or national origin. And I don't know why all these civil rights guys are at all these meetings. It has nothing to do with civil rights, So, and except for not discriminating. So the big war that's been going on in Congress the last 2 years and especially as the Republicans have taken over now the Senate, is that the Democrats have been absolutely obsessed and stubborn with the idea that it's got to be comprehensive immigration reform. Comprehensive meaning it has to legalize everybody, almost everybody of the people, the some so-called 12 million people who are here illegally. It's got to be all or nothing. I mean, I've heard Democrats say it's un-American to only legalize some. You have to legalize them all, and that makes it comprehensive. And the Republicans say, no, we don't want to legalize everybody, but there are some people we do want to legalize. And there's lots of issues in immigration, like expanding the investors' visas, or giving foreign students green cards, or making E-Verify a national requirement, not just voluntary. There's lots of issues that both Democrats and Republicans agree on. I can name probably 10 issues that they would agree on now. And the Republicans say, we don't want a big comprehensive omnibus bill that no one's read. We want it piecemeal. Let's start with the things we can all agree with. You will never hear the press cover that. I went to a hearing in July of 2013, the Senate passed this so-called comprehensive bill. It's a kind of, sort of comprehensive bill. And it actually only legalized 8 million of the 12 million. More or less the group that Obama has given DACA and DAPA to. We can talk about those too if you want. But I went to a hearing in July in the House, and they said, we are not going to consider this comprehensive bill. We do not want comprehensive, but we will consider pieces of it. And this hearing was about a bill, they called it the Kids Act, but it was a Dreamer Act. It was to legalize the Dreamers. There was not one paper that covered that. I was the only reporter there. It's like, oh, if the Republicans suggest it and it's piecemeal, it's absolutely unacceptable and they're anti-immigrant, so we can't talk about it. So I really beg you guys to look at all the stuff coming out. Liz, I have not met, and I know them all. I know Luis Gutierrez and Zolafko, and I know Stephen King, and I know, Raul Labrador, the new. He's a Republican, Latino, first Mormon Latino, tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot of them, but he's the first Republican, Latino, conservative. He was an immigration lawyer. Now every time Luis Gutierrez starts speaking Spanish in the Immigration Committee, Labrador answers him, in the same way. Not Martinez, I always call him Martinez, Menendez in the Senate, he'll start speaking Spanish, and then Cruz and Rubio just pipe right up. So the Democrats can't even pull the Spanish thing on them. The Republicans have just as many. They're not anti-immigrant, these guys. And many of them are Latinos. In fact, if you look at the most powerful Latinos in Congress right now, they're all Republicans. They're not Democrats. So, and the whole idea of the Latino vote is so hyped. Maybe not in California, but certainly in the rest of if you look at the Latino vote, there's only about 10 states where Latinos even make up more than 10% of the electorate. Only 10 states. And 9 of them are in the Southwest. And only one of them is solid Democrat. That's California. All the others are Republican, So I think we need to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. Try to keep the civil rights banter out of it. And let's look at immigration as just one of our biggest legacies. But also, it is a problem for every industrialized nation in the world. Who are we going to let in and who not? Who's going to contribute to our country? And who do we let in for humanitarian reasons? It's a tremendous issue, and we can have wonderful bipartisan discussions across the board. So I think there's a good chance that both sides want some immigration reform. The Democrats don't want to give Republicans any credit for it. But what I think will happen eventually is that the Republicans are going to just keep passing little bills, putting them on Obama's desk, enforcing him to veto a bunch of immigration bills that even Democrats want. So I think they're going to pass a bunch of little bills. They'll probably put some in a little package, and maybe eventually, just before the election, the Democrats will say, oh, it's a comprehensive bill, because it'll have 10, like I said, kind of, sort of. But then everybody wins, But I do think everybody knows there's things that need to be changed, and there's good people on all sides. And really, I may sound naive for a congressional reporter, but I'm pretty optimistic that there's some bipartisan movement for immigration.
How about presidential?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, it's really mathematical. It's very simple, really. I mean, I doubt that Democrats have a chance to get the House back until the next census. And we better have a few more Democratic governors. I'm sorry, I'm showing my mouth. We better have a few more Democratic governors if we're going to do that, Otherwise, because of districting, the Republicans pretty much own the House. Well, you could say the same thing for the White House. Because of the way the Electoral College is, favoring urban areas, which are highly Democratic, I think it's really unlikely, unless we totally screw it up, or Hillary doesn't run, that the Republicans can get the White House. So I think I'm rather enjoying watching them struggling with diversity. And frankly, I wish the Democrats were a little more diverse right now. It's like the two parties have switched sides. All of a sudden, all the Democrats talk about is abortion and gay marriage, and the Republicans are all over the map about all kinds of issues, It used to be the other way around. And the Democrats are single message, and Reid won't let any amendments on the floor that won't be passed by Democrats. I mean, when did the Democrats become Republicans? It's very weird. So I don't think, unless something happens, which it can. And the Senate's the one that can go back and forth. That's where the real battles are. And I think the Supreme Court is pretty balanced right now, even though it's probably the most undiverse Supreme Court we've had. I mean, no Protestants, 6 Catholics, 3 Jews, all 3 women are from Manhattan. I mean, really, Manhattan? That just offends me as a Californian. So, we really need to talk about true diversity there. Anyway, now that I've gotten all my opinions off the floor.
Well, back to immigration.
Right.
What is the status, or how is it going with the DREAM Act, and what's the update?
Dreamers are highly protected class right now. I mean, they had, in 2012, Obama gave them a deferred action, DACA. DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. A dreamer is supposedly anybody who came in before the age of 16 and who has been in the country 5 years consecutively and is over the age of 18. They're basically millennials, 18 to 30-year-olds, and who are in the country illegally. And if they can prove they came in before the age of 16, and if they say graduated from high school, but really they only need a GED, and then they don't need to have had it in English. There's a lot of stuff I don't like about the DREAM Act, but whatever. Obama basically gave them a deferred action from deportation in 2012 for 2 years, and he's renewed it for another 2 to 3 years. And then the dreamers, that wasn't enough for them. They were really wanted their parents. These are all adults. These are not kids. But somehow they can't live without their parents. So now they've been demanding for the last 2 years that their parents be legalized too. They've chained themselves to the gates. They have gone to congressmen's houses. They've been very, very aggressive. And it was probably because of them that Eric Cantor lost, which was not a wise move because he was one of the few Republicans who really were kind of pushing that Dreamers get legalized, go figure. But anyway, they have managed to annoy a lot of people. So when Obama was being pressurized to give deferred action to even more people. Now, not Dreamers, they're protected. They're protected now for at least 5 years. And now they want, more of the community, and especially the parents of the Dreamers. When he passed DAPA, when he made the executive action for DAPA, which is Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, that's what that group is. And I must say, it's a group that many Republicans have also said should probably be considered for legalization. They are the parents whose kids are American and who's, have served in the military, some of them. And that group, he did not give deferred action to Dreamers' parents. That was a real get off my tail, you guys. So just yesterday, Governor Cuomo announced that he was not going to give in-state tuition to Dreamers. And they are furious. But I think they pushed too much. They're already protected, but they did not have to force it for the 2014 election. And I think there's a lot of people, and I've heard very liberal groups said that they're really mad at them. And I mean, they've been given bad advice, but they've also it's a very small group. I mean, you go to these rallies, and the press gives them extraordinary press, but they really have to work to try to make it look like a crowd. There may be 30 people there. It's a very sympathetic group, but they've kind of overplayed their hand. Now, the interesting thing is that one of the groups that really, really wants Dreamers to be legalized are universities and colleges. Because do you know of HSIs? You should, here in California, you should really know about HSIs. Do you know what they are? They're Hispanic serving institutions. So we have minority serving institutions, of which the best known are the black universities and colleges now. And they were founded, some of them 200 years ago. They mainly have a black student body. They have been given special funding for years and years and years. Well, the Hispanics wanted something too, like that. So during, I think it was Reagan, no, it was Bush created a thing called Hispanic Serving Institutions. Now, and they also have a special fund to help Hispanic students, but they don't have their own campuses or have to be historic. To be a Hispanic Serving Institution and to be eligible for HSI funding, all you have to do is prove any institution of education, higher education, that they have 25% of their student body are Hispanic. Self-identified Hispanics. So it's very odd. I'll go to these meetings of educators, and I'll say I'm from the Hispanic Outlook, and they'll go, oh, we're 22%, and someone will say, oh, 24.1%, and I think UCSB is 24.6%. And how much money did they get? Oh, it's $1 billion fund. This is big money. Well, they're running out of natives, so what is the big source for Hispanic students? Dreamers. So they're dying that these Dreamers at least get in-state tuition. They are really encouraged. And so about 4 years ago, there's a fantastic lobbying organization called the Hispanic Association of Universities and Colleges. No, Colleges and Universities, HACU. It is one of the most brilliantly organized lobbyist groups that I know in Washington. And they have incredible annual legislative meetings that I always go to and find the latest. They were having a war with the Obama White House the first 2 years, with Cecilia Munoz particularly, because the Democrats saw Dreamers as driving comprehensive reform. It's a very sympathetic group, and it's a group that, well, if we're going to have comprehensive, then all these kids, all these young children who only know the United States as their only country will be legalized now. And it wasn't happening. Comprehensive immigration reform wasn't happening. So HACU started lobbying, well, let's have it a standalone bill. If it's so popular and it's so right, and even Republicans say, well, let's make it a standalone bill. And Cecilia Munoz in the White House and a lot of the immigrant advocates said, no way, it's got to be part of comprehensive. It's one of the main drivers of comprehensive. This is where I say they're obsessed about comprehensive, you see. So even something as good as maybe Dreamers, what became a big war between Haku and, I wrote a big story on between Haku and the White House, you know. And finally in 2010, when the House went Republican, they desperately decided this was going to be their last chance, so they tried to throw a standalone bill, and it passed the House and went to the Senate. And there were a bunch of Republicans said they were for it, you know. And then at the last minute, particularly Kay Bailey Hutchinson in Texas, she voted against it. And they were furious at her. And she said, well, and it's true, they threw everything in the kitchen sink into that bill. They tried to make it a comprehensive, sneaky bill, even though they called it a DREAM Act. And she said, well, this isn't anything what I'd agreed to vote for. And they lost 4 crucial Republican Senate votes on that. But of course then they called, well, the Republicans are anti-immigrant. But they did it in their zeal to make it comprehensive. So, you know, the Democrats have a lot to answer for in this politics too.
So the extension still kept it?
Well, the extension is, yeah, it's good till Obama's out of office.
Well, but I mean, still the cutoff age is 30.
Oh, yeah, and
How did that get determined?
I actually think he extended it. I think extended the upper region. I heard something about that they kept the lower end, but they've extended the upper end, which, you know, the 86 bill, okay, that was what, 96, 2000, almost 20 years ago. So if somebody came in at 15, and then 20 years ago, they would have gotten amnesty. But if they came in a year later, they wouldn't have. And it almost seems to me like they're trying to use the Dreamer Act to build the bridge between those who didn't get amnesty in 86, that they would get it now if they came in at that early age. And, you know, I mean, there's a good argument. If someone's been here 10, 20 years, it's hard to say they shouldn't at least get to apply. And they still can't get jobs, though. Well, see, that's the thing. And this is where we get the constitutional argument. Now, Obama, again, it's very simple. The executive branch, or the legislative branch makes the laws, no? The executive branch implements the laws. They're the executives. And the judicial branch decides if they're constitutional if they come up for question. Otherwise, they're considered constitutional unless they come up for a question. And then the Supreme Court has the final say. So part of being an executive is deciding if you have the resource, how you're going to implement this bill, you know. And so we have an immigration bill that says people who are here illegally should be deported. You know, they're not here legally. But we don't have enough resources to deport everybody. And really, most Americans don't want to deport people. They really have a thing about deporting people. And it's you know, it's a very compassionate thing. But he doesn't have the resource. So he has the right to use executive action to say, well, this is how I'm going to use my resources. And so he says this group, it is individual, it is case by case, but he's going to say, in a case-by-case basis, anybody who falls under this particular group, came into the country under 16, is here illegally, was here 5 years, graduated from college or got a GED, they can apply for deferred action. And by executive order, I'm going to say they would be waived from deportation. The president doesn't tell you who you give driver's licenses to. And work permits is an immigration status. He cannot make immigration laws. He has the right to say how he's going to implement a law, but he doesn't have, this is the question, does he have the right to give an immigration benefit to people he's giving a deferred action to? And the court is saying, you know, the Texas court says, no, he doesn't. And it's going to hurt our state if he does. So that's what this is all about. Did he go too far with these deferred actions? Not by the deferred action, but by giving job benefits and everything else, you know. So that's going to be interesting. Okay, it's wonky enough for you. I could go on for hours, but you know.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate it. And as Joni said earlier, this will be up on our website if you want to go back and hear more about this, refresh your memory, because there was lots of information. So I'm waiting with bated breath for the book, but I like this kind of wonky stuff myself. So anyway, thank you all for coming. And just as a reminder, we have a table in the back. So there's information about the league, envelopes to join the league, and if you're not a member of the league, as Joni said earlier, you can join now for $25. So think about that. That's a deal. All right, thank you all so much for coming.